So, in front of the divinity of God, he repented and said that he would never betray God. But because of his wife, he gave up his soul to the demon. And finally, his conscience was completely dead. And even though he sinned, he did not know that, he didn't even realize it was sin. And when he did wrong, he didn't realize he was wrong. He became the channel of the demon and the medium of Satan. One day, it must have been the time of the harvesting of grapes. And he was walking on the palace. He saw a beautiful vineyard in front of his palace. During the grape season, it's very, very beautiful. It looks like a green carpet with purple grapes. Jesus took Jesus to the top of the mountain. And when he tempted him with all the glories of the world, he showed him also a vineyard and said, if you bow down to me once, I'll give you all of this. When you go back home and they show you paychecks, lands, and fame, I hope you will not be fooled by them. I didn't know that paychecks had so much power. Such weak sons and daughters of God. So, when Ahab saw the vineyard, he became greedy. Do you know whose property it was? It belonged to a man named Naboth. So he came down and he asked for Naboth. Naboth, sell your vineyard to me. I'll give you all the money you want. In Israel, there was a custom where you cannot sell your inheritance because it's supposed to be divinely given to you. Even from the smallest things, you couldn't sell it. You can't sell, you can't buy. And even in Korea, in my hometown, there was a huge mansion. And you have to go through many gates in order to go to the main house. It was 14 generations old. But it had to be torn down because of a government order. Because they were going to make a big reservoir. And the owner died of mental depression because that was his inheritance, which had come down the generations, and it was lost in his time when he was alive. So anyway, the Israelites had this kind of custom. So he couldn't sell it. So Naboth said, Your Majesty, please forgive me. I'd like to just give it to you, but this is a property which was given to me, handed down to me, so I can't sell it to you. I'm sorry. So after being refused, he was upset and he went back up to his house upset. Jezebel, his wife, came in. King, what's wrong with you? Oh, I asked Naboth to sell his vineyard to me, but he refused. Oh, king, don't worry. I'll get it for you. Unless husband and wife are similar-minded, they cannot live together. So this evil pair, they devised a scheme to take it away from such a kind man, kind farmer. Ahab was rich and he had 2 ivory palaces. The nation was his. But he was greedy for a poor farmer's vineyard. And now he's planning to kill him. So he called Naboth to his palace. And he chose some of the wickedest people and had them accuse him of sinning against God. And so they put all these untrue sins and crimes upon him. And so this man who had no sin, this righteous man, was stoned to death. And he lost his land. And then what do you think happened to the Naboth's family? Can you believe he was established? He was set up to be a shepherd for God's people, but he is committing such an evil deed. They thought they had committed this crime in secret, but God knew. And he was a witness, invisible witness to all that. And at the time when Ahab went to go see that vineyard, he sent Elijah and to pronounce sentence of death to Ahab and his family. Of course, Elijah, this is his death, asking for his death. You know, once the king or presidents go around, here we have all kinds of the army, police, and guards. But all of a sudden, this man from the country says, you're going to die, and same with your family. You and your family will all die. You know, that's asking to die. So he knew that this time, he would be cut to pieces. And yet he still sent Elijah. You know, who is the prophet? Not Elijah. Already the job went to Elisha. But Elijah made one mistake, and so he lost his job to Elisha. But why is God using Elijah, not Elisha? The reason is because God loved Elijah. He liked Elijah. And he followed Elijah around. I hope that you will also be like that as well. Elijah could say, God, when is it that you forsake me? Now you want to use me? You use Elijah. You use Elisha. Why is it you always have me all to do the dirty work? He could have said that. But even though he knew that he would be cut to pieces and die, he said, okay, Father, if you want me to go one more time, I will do it. What a wonderful son. So he allowed the other Elisha to be in a safe place, and he took the place of death. And this is what it means to love your neighbors more than yourself and to love God with all your life. So, without a word of complaint, he went. And he went to that evil sinner to sentence him to death. And he said, you and your family will be completely destroyed. And Jezebel's blood will also burst just where Naboth's blood was shed. And though he was a farmer with no knife or sword, there was not one soldier, one guard who could take out their sword and kill him. And instead, they all shuddered in fear. In the dazzling presence of God's divinity, they could not move. You know, a long time ago when the priests of Israel, who said their church was the Orthodox church, and they had millions of worshippers, and they displayed themselves with such a majestic appearance, and they worshipped with exaggerated formalities, and they despised Jesus and his followers. They called him a carpenter's son, an ignorant man, who did not even know what theology is. And they called him a fanatic. But when Jesus went into the temple and rebuked them and say, why did you make my father's house a den of thieves? And overturn all the tables and drove away all the sheep. They couldn't stand before the presence of God's divinity. And they all ran away. They forgot that they were the priests and they ran away in bare feet. They were truly thieves. When multitudes came to Jerusalem to worship, these priests, they bought a whole bunch of sheep. They bought them like they were traders, and they bought them for $50 and sold them for $100, $150, and they took all the profits. Not only that, they took the money from even the poor people. If they were a thief, it would have been better. Because everyone knows that they're thieves. When they come out as priests and they're stealing, they're taking the money from the people. They were sent to give eternal life and to transform them, not to rob them of their money. But you know, the churches nowadays, I know better than the Jerusalem church. So when Jesus chased out all those thieves, though they had looked down upon him in front of God's divinity, they all ran away bare feet, forgetting that they were the priests, forgetting their position And after running a while, they say, why are we running away from that carpenter's son? And they came back embarrassed. And Jesus was there teaching, healing the weak and wounded souls, as if nothing had happened. In the same way, Elijah, when he appeared before Ahab, though Ahab had looked down upon him and despised him in front of God's divinity, he shivered in fear, and no one would dare raise a sword, and he just walked out after pronouncing the sentence of death. People say, I attended the Summer Elijah Gospel Institute, and everything is correct. There's nothing wrong. It's the truth, God's word, and life from heaven. But just agreeing does not mean you're saved. You may say, I listen to everything, that's real. Agreeing cannot save you. Unless the God who gave you this truth, unless you accept Him as a personal God, and He abides in your heart, and His divinity is in your heart, then can you be saved. It seems correct. That has nothing to do with your salvation. And let's look at 2 Kings chapter 1 verse 3 and 4. But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, Arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say to them, Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Now therefore thus says the Lord, you shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die. Here, this story about another shepherd of God's church. His name is Ahaziah. God had made him king to be a leader of his people. But once he became sick, an incurable disease, instead of going to the living God who was with him, he called his workers and said, I'm getting sicker. There's a famous sorceress in Ekron. Let's go ask her and see if I will be healed or not. This was the leader of God's church. Can you imagine how our Father felt all throughout history having experienced this? When His chosen servant is supposed to represent God's character and His deep heart and lead him to Him and lead them to eternal life, He was leading them to the demon. So these officers who were sent by God to go to that sorceress in Ekron, that spirit medium, God again told Elijah, go in front of those officers and say, because there's no God in Israel that you are going to ask a sorceress, your king shall not come down from his bed, but die for sure. This also is asking for his death. It's no way for him to live. Like in Korea, even the military police cannot prevent a company commander for more than a few minutes. When I was in the army, when the military police went to go inspect the company commander's house, they were not allowed. They could not stay for more than a few minutes. And yet, when a king of a nation set out his officers, and some man all of a sudden comes out and says, your king will die, do you think they would leave him alone? They would cut him to pieces. And yet, God had Elijah do this job again, which required his death. Even though Elisha is supposed to be the prophet. We can see that God loved Elijah more than even Elisha. He's a God who could not bear to live away from Elijah. I hope that you will become the same last Elijahs. God has emotions and feelings just like us. He is happy. He loves us. He likes us. He even desires us till we get sick. Then, we are following the sons of Satan, and we don't know that it's a shame. We should be those lovely children whom God and Jesus love to follow. So Elijah, as his beloved son, said, yes, of course, if that's what you want, I'll do it. What a relationship between father and son. So he appeared in front of those officers and scolded them. Because there is no God in Israel, that you're going to ask a God of Ekron? So they became pale and they ran away, scared. So as I was lying on his bed, his officers just came in, whispering, oh, what happened? Your Majesty, we are going over a hill. And then this man who showed up all of a sudden and said, because there's no God in Israel, that you are going to inquire of God in Ekron. Go to the king and tell him he would surely die on his bed and not come down from it. Oh, that's Elijah. All through history, only Elijahs could rebuke kings and leaders in the world for their sins. It had to be Elijah. Nowadays in the churches, if there's some professors or pastors who claim to rebuke the corruption in churches, they say, we're going to fire you and we're going to take away your position. Then they stop. God does not send these kind of cowards. Only those who can stand up to rebuke the corruption of the churches and the world, even risking up their lives to save them. Those kind of people are Elijahs. So afterwards, God gave him another command. Now, go to Isaiah, go in front of him, and pronounce the sentence of death. So this is even more dangerous. If he wants to go to the king's bed, you know that there'll be all kinds of military and security. And yet, if he went to the king's bed to rebuke him and scold him, they would not even be able to find his dead body. So even though the prophet is supposed to be Elisha, God was asking Elijah to do this dangerous job. Again, it seems that God always has Elijah do these kind of dangerous jobs. Why? Because the last Elijahs will do a job which they must risk their lives for. And that's why the first Elijah was given to us as an example. Yeah, look at the work I'm doing now. I'm asking. I'm risking my life. Am I not exposing all the deceptions and hypocrisy of today's churches? Even though they're making so much money, I seem to break families who are living peacefully, and yet which are going to their destruction. I denounce countries, communities, religions, and educations. Yet this is the only way that they can be saved. No church, no country, no educational system can be saved. But even though I have done this meeting up to now, no one has been able to touch my life. I am perfectly safe. As long as I'm doing God's appointed work, no one can touch me. No one can harm me. And though they even try and kill me, those kind of people have come every single meeting. Sometimes they even come to our room with a little knife in their pocket. And other people say they're going to come with a gun to kill me. And even then, detectives and police come, and maybe they came even this meeting. But while we are obeying God's command, for those days, not one person, no power can touch us. When Moses went to Pharaoh, he could have died too. But God said, I will fill your days. I will fill the number of your days. So I hope that you will obey God's order in peace, with a peaceful heart. So, without any permission, he walked to the king. Why should he receive permission from anyone when it's God's command? So he went to the bed where King Ahaziah was lying. And he said, in spite of being the leader of Israel, because there's no God in Israel, you still went to ask from a demon Ekron, therefore you will surely die in the bed. You went up and you will not be able to come down from it again. And he never came down from his bed alive. then who would dare touch him? If they had touched him, the whole palace would have been destroyed. So no one would dare touch him, even touch the clothes that he was wearing. And he just walked out, surrounded by God's divinity. When our religion and the government and the nation were united in order to destroy the last Elijahs, I hope that you will obey God's order with perfect peace in mind, and I'll go to heaven. Then after fulfilling all these missions, which was risking his life, God came to him and said, as they were walking hand in hand, Elijah, yes. Now the number of days for Elijah was filled. He completed his mission. Yet God could have taken him to heaven and let him rest in the grave until Jesus came again. But he couldn't dare live without such a lovely son for even a moment. He would become lovesick. So Elijah, yes, I can't live without you. Let's go home together. You know, when Elisha was called, he said, Lord, let me have a farewell party with my family. And they had a party. And then he left. But when Elijah was called to do his work, he only said yes. And when Moses was called, he refused so many times, and then later God became upset and scolded him. But Elijah was always yes. He started with a yes and he ended with a yes. There's no one in the Bible who is as obedient as Elijah. In these last days, only those who only say yes will be the last Elijahs. Those who say, well, let me think about it, let me pray about it, and think about their prestige, fame, and their paycheck will never be called. I hope you'll become the lovely Elijahs without whom God cannot live, without for even a minute, who only say yes. So God said to Elijah, you know, I can't live without you. Let's go home together. He could have said, well, let me say goodbye to the widow and my friends who've been here for 3.5 years. Let me go home and say goodbye. But just as he always said, he said, yes, if that's what you want, I'll go. And he left. He's the only one who does not have a grave on this earth. Even Moses had a grave. I hope that you also become those who do not have a grave on this earth. You know what do those churches in the world say today? When Jesus comes, I'm going to go to heaven in a cloud. How ridiculous. They are dreaming. Please, tell them to stop dreaming. Tell them to wake up. Then what God will ever take those kind of rotten, smelling churches and put them on clouds and take them to heaven? They only look for money. They only look for fame. What God will take to heaven? Those kind of sinners. They do not live for God's glory. They only want to live for their own glory. Who will take them to heaven? The Elijahs which God will take to heaven on clouds are the ones who will risk their lives for God's glory. And even if they lose their life 10, 100 times, they will uplift God and glorify Him among the corrupted churches in the world. Is there anyone who saw Moses go up to heaven? Anyone see Enoch go up to heaven? No, only Elijah. He's the only one whom people saw him go up to heaven. And that's why this is the fulfillment of God's promise that He would give glory to those who glorified Him. So because Elijah gave Him the greatest glory, our Father also repaid Him with the greatest glory. In the same way, because the last Elijah will give the greatest glory to Him, He will also give Him the greatest glory and take Him to heaven in chariots of cloud in front of heaven and earth. I hope that you will become these last Elijahs. Will you all become those kind of Elijahs?